It was the summer of 2016, and to give you some context, my parents would often go on vacations, leaving me to stay home alone for 2 weeks to take care of our dogs and maintain the garden. I'd always felt a bit uneasy due to past experiences of being followed home a few times. The neighborhood was still fairly new, surrounded by forests, and I occasionally saw junkies hanging around while walking back from the shops. Despite my concerns, I generally felt safe at home with my 4 large dogs. Nothing ever really happened since most of my neighbors were friends with my dad, which gave me a strong sense of security. Our house was also protected by a tall fence topped with small spikes, making it almost impossible for anyone to climb over without getting injured. The first couple of days passed without incident, aside from hearing a few thuds in the garden, but I didn't think much of it because it was usually just Martin messing around with my mom's flowers, something even my dogs had learned to ignore. After 2 days, I needed to go to the shops, but I was busy during the day, so I ended up going in the evening as it started to get dark, not my brightest idea. I grabbed what I needed and began walking home along my usual path. It was a busy route in the evening since people often walked their dogs there. The area was a mix of park and forest. As I walked, texting on my phone, I noticed a guy I had just passed on a bench get up and start walking behind me. I assumed he was just another local from my neighborhood heading in the same direction, so I didn't pay him much attention. When I exited the forest and reached the main road where the houses begin, he was still behind me. I thought perhaps he lived nearby, but when I reached the last turn to my house and he continued to follow, I realized he wasn't one of my neighbors. That's when the fear kicked in. Fortunately, my neighbor, who lived just to the left of my house, was outside watering his plants. When he saw me looking stressed, he began talking to me, knowing my parents were out of town. The moment the man trailing me saw my neighbor, he quickly turned and ran back toward the forest. I called my parents to tell them what had happened, but they reassured me that there was nothing to worry about, reminding me our neighborhood was safe and I had my dogs for protection. Trying to calm myself, I carried on with my night as usual. Just for some extra context, when my parents are away, I sleep in their bedroom on the ground floor to keep my dogs from going upstairs in the dark, where they might hurt themselves. That night, I was lying in bed, reading a book, with my dogs sound asleep around me. Normally, they sleep on the floor near the bed, but they must have sensed my unease. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, like something tapping the window in the next room. At first, I thought it was Martin again, but this time, my dogs began growling at the window in my bedroom. After a few moments of silence, there was another thud, this time right on the window in my room. My panic began to rise, but I tried to stay calm. The third sound was much louder, and it became clear someone was banging on all the windows of the house. I started crying because I knew exactly what was going on. I left my bedroom and moved to the center of the house, where I could see the front door. That's when I saw a shadowy figure peering inside and banging on the small window next to the door. I felt helpless, so I hid out of sight under a table and pulled out my phone. The banging continued as the man tried to break the glass. I called my dad, but he didn't pick up. It was around 2 a.m., and they were on holiday. I called again 2 more times until my mom finally answered, confused about why I was calling so late. By this point, the man was slamming against the door with his full body, trying to force it open, and my mom could hear it happening over the phone. My dad began urgently calling everyone he could, his brother, our neighbors, my grandma, trying to get them to my house as fast as possible. The first person to arrive was the same neighbor who had spoken to me earlier. He scared the guy off, who ran to the back garden. Even though help had arrived, I was still too terrified to open the front door. About 10 minutes later, my uncle, aunt, and grandma showed up. My uncle had a spare key, so he let the dogs out to chase after the intruder. My dogs are hunting dogs, so they're not friendly with strangers. My uncle and neighbor then grabbed flashlights and, along with the dogs, searched the backyard, checking every corner to ensure it was safe. I'll never forget how my aunt and grandma came to comfort me as I sat crying, clutching onto a chair. The man had escaped through the back of our garden into the neighbor's yard, likely trying to get away from the dogs. He had managed to damage the small window by the main door, leaving the glass cracked and the door hanging loose from its hinges. I dread thinking about what might have happened if my family and neighbors hadn't arrived so quickly. I don't usually tell this story anymore because most people either feel uncomfortable hearing it or start offering advice on what they think I should have done. What they don't understand is that when you're in a state of panic, your brain doesn't work the same way. It's not as easy as making a quick decision or thinking clearly, something many people fail to grasp. This incident happened about 5 years ago when I was living in a nice apartment in downtown Memphis, working as an IT technician. I got home from work at my usual time, around 4:30 p.m., unlocked the door, and went inside. I placed my phone, wallet, and keys on the kitchen counter, hearing the front door slam shut behind me. Then, I started doing some chores around the house. Growing up in a small town, I wasn't in the habit of locking my door during the day, especially since my husband was due home soon. But since that day, I've never forgotten to lock my door once in the last 5 years. I went into my bathroom and then into my walk-in closet to hang up some laundry I'd started earlier that morning. As I did, I heard the front door open. Thinking it was my husband, I called out, "I'm in here, love." But when there was no response, I began to feel uneasy. I tried to dismiss the feeling, assuming he hadn't heard me. I walked out to the living room and kitchen area to check. On the other side of my kitchen island stood a man I didn't recognize. He looked older, probably in his 50s, but I can't recall his exact features. I was in complete shock. He just stood there, staring at me with a blank expression. He wasn't wearing a mask or holding anything, he was just silently watching me, which made it even more unsettling. For a moment, I thought he might have entered the wrong apartment by mistake and would apologize and leave, but he didn't. When he continued to just stand there, I knew I had to act. I tried to appear taller and more confident, which isn't easy for someone my size. Taking a deep breath, I spoke firmly, telling him to get out and that he had no right to be there. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline, but he ignored me completely, as if I hadn't said a word. He started picking up my things, my phone, wallet, and keys, methodically putting them in his pockets. Watching him, it hit me that this wasn't some harmless mistake, this man was a real threat. I moved toward my laptop, my only other way to get help, even though I had to get closer to the intruder to reach it. We were still about 12 to 15 feet apart, so I figured I could grab it and run before he could catch me. I picked up the laptop and turned to run, but I saw him start to move toward me. I sprinted to the bathroom, the only place where I could put 2 locked doors between us. I slammed the first door shut and locked it just in time. Seconds later, I heard him trying to open it. I quickly ran into the closet and locked that door as well. I opened my laptop, logged into Facebook Messenger, and frantically messaged my husband, telling him to call 911 because there was an intruder in the apartment. Thankfully, he saw my messages within minutes, reassured me that he had called the police, and said he was on his way home to help if he could. Though I felt a little relief, I still waited anxiously. Suddenly, I heard the bathroom door creak open, and the intruder entered, pounding on the closet door, trying to break it down. This is when people usually start giving me advice on what I should have done differently. But I was frozen in fear and shock. I didn't scream, cry, or search for a weapon. I didn't even try to brace the door. People often tell me that if I'd screamed, someone in the apartment complex would have heard me and come to help. They ask why I didn't grab something heavy from the closet to defend myself. I don't really have an answer for them. Somehow, though, the closet door held firm. I heard the intruder's frustrated footsteps as he walked back into the living room. Things started breaking, bottles smashing, drawers, cabinets, and the refrigerator being flung open as he ransacked the apartment. I stayed in the closet, quietly crying. I felt ashamed for how I was handling the situation, but I still messaged my mom, even though she lived 15 hours away. I needed comfort and to tell her how much I loved her. I can only imagine how terrified and helpless she felt, knowing her daughter was in danger and there was nothing she could do. She kept messaging me, begging me to keep replying. The intruder returned to the closet door, mumbling words I couldn't understand. Just then, I heard the front door open again. This time it was my husband, shouting for me. The intruder moved back toward the living room. I opened the closet door and ran out to find my husband on the ground, struggling with the intruder. The man kept mumbling and sometimes yelling, but he didn't really fight back much. This part is a blur. I just remember feeling like the room was spinning and being terrified for my husband. The fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't think straight. The police finally arrived, but it took about 25 minutes for them to get to the apartment. I was shocked by how long it took. Time seemed to stretch on forever, even though the wait probably felt shorter than it actually was. This isn't a criticism of the police, but 25 minutes felt like a long time during a home invasion. The officers recovered my belongings and removed the intruder from the apartment. Afterward, I had to file a police report, recounting everything that had happened. In just 30 minutes, the scariest experience of my life was over, but I've carried the fear with me ever since. If something similar has happened to you and you're still dealing with the aftermath, the sleepless nights, the nightmares, constantly checking your locks, here's what helped me. A year after the incident, my husband and I moved to the Midwest for his job. We chose a safe town and a secure apartment complex on the 3rd floor, with only one entrance. It was then I realized that my greatest fear wasn't just that it might happen again, but that I would be just as unprepared. I knew I couldn't rely on locking the door and hoping to hide behind it. That wasn't enough. So, I joined a martial arts school with a self-defense program and started taking classes. At first, I stayed quiet, keeping to myself at the back of the room, but the instructor, who was kind and understanding, helped me build confidence and slowly face my fear. After a few months, I finally shared with him why I had started training. I've now been training for years, and the difference it's made in my life is incredible. The scared, quiet girl who hid in a closet no longer exists. I'm confident, strong, and capable of protecting myself in my own home. I'm no longer ashamed of how I reacted, and I know what steps to take to keep myself safe. It didn't happen overnight, but it was worth it. Everyone's journey is different, and whatever way you choose to deal with your own story is the right choice for you. The latter half of 2017 has been incredibly draining for me, both emotionally and physically. The toughest challenge was moving my father into a nursing home as his health rapidly declined. It wasn't an easy choice, but he needed more care than I could provide on my own. My father still lives in Tasmania, where I grew up, while I now reside and work in Brisbane, which makes visiting him difficult. The distance between the two cities is around 1,500 miles, adding to the stress since I've had to travel back and forth frequently to manage everything. I've been flying to Tasmania, which takes about 3.5 hours, roughly twice a month to handle my dad's affairs. His house is old and in disrepair, so I've spent a lot of time fixing it up in preparation to sell. I've cleared out all of his furniture and personal items, except for a pile of blankets and pillows I keep to make a bed on the floor when I stay overnight. The house is in a semi-rural area, surrounded by thick trees and bushes, and it's an old, damp place where everything creaks. With no electricity and poor security, staying there at night feels eerie. The doors have locks, but they're flimsy and could easily be pushed open with enough force. I arrived on Christmas Eve, picked up a rental car, and drove an hour to my dad's house. Before heading there, I visited a friend who lives about 10 minutes away. We had a few drinks and caught up on how the year had been. After a while, I realized I was too tipsy to drive, so my friend's wife gave me a ride to my dad's house and offered to pick me up the next morning to retrieve my car. I got to my dad's house around midnight, and it was pitch dark inside. I was still a bit buzzed and forgot that the electricity had been shut off, so I used my phone as a flashlight. While walking through the house, I noticed that some of my tools were missing. Since the house had been vacant for some time, I figured it was just some local kids taking advantage of the situation. I didn't bother calling the police for a few missing tools. Thankfully, the large toolbox where I keep my more valuable power tools was still there, although I saw signs that someone had tried to pry it open. Feeling worn out, I set up my makeshift bed in one of the empty rooms but had trouble falling asleep. The wind rustled through the trees outside, and everything was quiet except for the faint ringing in my ears. Then suddenly, I heard what sounded like boots crunching on the gravel outside. My heart started racing when a loud bang echoed from the metal railing at the back door. I tried to convince myself it was just a possum or something, but moments later, I heard the back door creak open. I froze. Footsteps echoed through the house, and then I heard the laundry cupboard being opened. I was at the far end of the hall but could hear whispering. I quickly grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering to the dispatcher while hiding under a pillow to muffle my voice. She assured me that officers were on their way. Meanwhile, I could hear the intruders attempting to break the lock on the toolbox. The dispatcher suggested I lock the door of the room I was in, but as I moved toward it, the floor creaked loudly. I froze again, and the house fell silent. After what felt like forever, I took another step, and the creaking must have spooked them because I heard the intruders hurry out the back door. I locked the bedroom door and told the dispatcher that they seemed to have left. She advised me to stay put until the police arrived, and I was more than willing to do that. Within about 5 minutes, the police arrived, but by then, the intruders were long gone. They had tried and failed to break into the toolbox. One of the officers remarked, "Why didn't they just use bolt cutters? Amateurs." I mentioned to the police that I had noticed some of my tools were missing and that it seemed like someone had tried to break into the toolbox earlier. One of the officers had a theory: they probably broke in earlier, took what they could, tried to open the toolbox but failed, and left to get something to break the lock. When they came back, I had already arrived, and that likely scared them off. I felt relieved that the timing had worked in my favor. After making a report, I stayed up until sunrise, getting only a couple of hours of sleep before my friend's wife picked me up to retrieve my car. I asked if I could store my tools at their place for safekeeping, and they agreed. Later that day, I visited my dad at his care home and had Christmas lunch with him and his new friends. The next day, I went to a hardware store and bought stronger locks for the house. With the new locks installed, I felt a little more secure knowing the house was better protected.